Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of An Evening with the PM. I'm James Knight, also known as the Philosophical Muser, and I hope we have a really interesting show for you this evening, much to the frustration of the majority of Christian believers. I think for too long now, young Earth creationism has cast a shadow over the reputation of Christianity and the church. It's caused many people to leave the faith in confusion, sometimes never to return. And of course, it gives atheists easy material with which to criticize the faith as an inconsistent object of ignorance and ridicule, rather than as a consistent beacon of enlightenment, so to speak. So I've made my own contributions in criticism of young Earth creationism, but I had an idea that I put out on Facebook recently that would be really good to hear from some people who used to believe in young Earth creationism, but who've now seen the light, so to speak, and they now accept evolution alongside their Christian faith. So I put out this request, and I was pleased to have six people respond. Three of which are here tonight, and I'll do another show with the other three. So I'm really delighted to be joined by my guests, my first three guests tonight: James McGrath, Peter Ross, and Marv Falconburg. So they're former denizens of the rigid structures of young Earth creationism, but I'm pleased to say that they've come over in their lifetime to the evolutionary standpoint alongside their faith. So I myself have not been a young Earth creationist, but to those listeners who may have grown up stigmatized with the teaching that their faith and the science of evolution are incompatible, you're in good company here, as all three of my guests, as I said, have previously set sail on similar winds of curiosity and doubt and among the young Earth creationism they were taught, and they had the courage and the humility to embrace new insights about the reality of evolution and its compatibility with the faith. So thank you. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And I'll just read your biographies that you kindly sent, and then we can kick off with the seat of the pants discussion. So James McGrath is the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair of New Testament Language and Literature at Butler University, where he teaches courses on biblical studies, as well as the intersection between religion and science, as well as science fiction. He is a member of an American Baptist church where he teaches an adult Sunday school class and is also involved in music from time to time. Reverend Peter Ross has served in ministry for over 30 years, the first 25 in the Assemblies of God Church, when then transferring to the United Church of Christ in 2015. He assisted in pastoring a small UCC church in New Jersey before moving to Michigan in 2016, where he joined the Plymouth United Church of Christ in the Grand Rapids, where he is now. Currently serving as chair of the Outreach Board and lead of the media department. He's a long-time student of paleontology, archaeology, and ancient and classic studies. Reverend Ross once used his extensive fossil and artifacts collection to teach young Earth creationism until a study of stromatolites, which are layered sedimentary formations, broke his dogmatic theology and allowed him to revisit his studies of these sciences. And Marv Falconburg is a lifelong resident of Colorado and lifetime in the church. He is an architect and a city planner, currently deputy city manager of a small city near Denver. He's been married for 42 years to his high school sweetheart, and he enjoys his three grown-up children and their families, including 7 grandkids and 5 grandpuppies. He's been an elder and worship leader in non-denomination Grace Church and plays drums and percussion. And he says he's also been on a lifelong truth quest, which continues to this day. Amen. I think we all share that. So, guys, thank you again for joining, and let's try to have a really good discussion. So can we start then? If you'd like to, let's start with James, as you're on the top left. If you could give a brief summary and testimony of what you believed, and then what made you come out of young Earth creationism to accept evolution alongside your faith, and then we'll go to Peter and Marv.
Okay, well, what I believe could be a very long, whole separate episode, but I'll assume that you're referring specifically to beliefs about evolution and creation and things like that.
Yeah.
And so I'll start with the story of sort of my journey through it, both into and out of, and then we can have some follow-up after that if necessary. But very briefly, I grew up in the Roman Catholic Church and came to a personal faith in connection with a church that was at least loosely affiliated with the Assemblies of God. So, Peter, we may find ourselves talking more about that at some point. So came to a personal faith in my teens. There was no particular emphasis on young Earth creationism then. In fact, my experience in Pentecostal circles was that there was much more emphasis on experience than on like doctrine or anything like that. But as I was gearing up to figure out what I want to do, having my life having taken a turn in that particular direction, I was exploring going to Bible college. And as I got involved in volunteering on sort of mission-related things and things like that, someone took me to hear a talk. I think it was when I was in Ireland, but it was an American who was speaking. And they basically came with the whole young Earth creationist spiel, shall we say, with Darwin recanted on his deathbed, and how much dust they should have found on the moon, and the fact that the geological column was come up by this person was an atheist, and this is all and so I did a detour into that, thinking that was what was expected, required from my faith. So I have a very different relationship to young Earth creationism than a lot of people, in as much as I didn't grow up steeped in it, right? I came to personal faith, had a sort of born again experience, and then came to young Earth creationism. And as somebody who's always been an avid reader, eager to learn, started looking for books on the subject, looking to learn more about this. And I found in the public library system in New York City, which is where I'm from originally, a book that sounded like it might be relevant. It was called Science and Creationism, and it was edited by Ashley Montague. And as I read it, I realized that there was another perspective on these things, and that some of the things that I had been hearing were not, in fact, true. And so there were some challenges offered. And because I was a sort of voracious reader and interested to not so, it wasn't an effort to fact check. It was just the book had creationism in the title. And so I had been exposed to this, had embraced it, was trying to find out more, and found out, oh, okay, maybe some of what I heard is wrong. And so I was shifted by way of that and pursuing further information out of young Earth creationism. But another major influence, and I'll end with this, was as I was working on my doctorate, I was doing some reading in the sociology of religion. And so I was reading some things by Peter Berger, a famous sociologist of religion. And he made a reference in one of his books to the fact that he said, matters of science and creationism and that kind of thing, really they shouldn't take up too much of our time, because they're really only of interest to some people who had this narrow, very fringe upbringing and this particular type of very like marginal form of Christianity. And that having an author who is a widely esteemed expert on matters to do with religion and sociology to say, yeah, so this view that I had assumed was mainstream and I thought I have to apologize for departing from actually is something fringe in relation to the wider Christian tradition. That also was just eye-opening and made me aware both of the fact, the status of young Earth creationism historically in relation to historic Christianity, but also the fact that we so readily assume, and it's natural for us to do so, that what we've been exposed to and what we've experienced is normative. And so those experiences really were the formative ones that have gotten me to where I am now. And I won't add any more to that yet, but welcome follow-up questions.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good perspective. One thing to throw into the mix just before we go to Peter is, yeah, regarding what people perceive as normal, I think it's quite interesting because to me it seems like um, young Earth creationism, where it used to be, and we have to distinguish between Britain and America here, but it seemed to me that a lot of Americans, particularly in the Bible Belt and certain areas of America, were just steeped in young Earth creationism. It was just the natural thing they were, and they didn't really ever meet many Christians who thought differently. And of course, they're very good at teaching them that if they do think differently, then they're probably, backsliders or compromised Christians and what have you. But I think what I've noticed in my lifetime as a Christian has been just how many more young Earth creationists there are in the UK. And I think it's largely because the kind of churches that are most influential, because I mean the Church of England is dying a slow death, and it's not very influential in the UK, and neither is the Catholic Church. But the Pentecostal churches, the churches, and the African churches that have come over, and the independent churches, they're the ones that are growing the most. But most of them do believe in young Earth creationism. So I think this is a great time to be having this conversation because actually it's proliferating in a way that, as far as I can tell, from most of my church experience, the majority of people, even in the UK now, in the kind of churches I'm talking about, are young Earth creationists. So I'm often seen as a bit of an anomaly in our churches because of my acceptance of evolution. But thank you. Yeah, Peter, I'd love to hear your testimony, how you believed and then came out, and then Marv too. So tell us yours.
Alrighty. Mine is a little bit the inverse of James's. I was very much steeped in young Earth creationism, pretty much from the very get-go. The creationism was a very strong pillar within the Assemblies of God's Church in the New Jersey area that I grew up in. In fact, I distinctly remember one of my first books on whales. My grandmother had gone through with a marker and crossed off every reference of millions and changed it to thousands of years. So, that was just kind of, and then you would read the book, and obviously, there was a reason for changing it and must be true. And so growing up, we had a number of young Earth conferences and clubs in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and New York, and I became part of that circuit very early on, and by 91 had internalized a enormous amount of the creationism literature, and by the early 90s was actually now starting to teach at these different clubs and group meetings. My upbringing was also kind of interesting. My grandmother liked feeding my interest in science, and so arranged for me to go on a number of fossil digs and trips around the world where I would just find a variety of fossils, and then I would label, the location and such, and what type of animal it was, and doing some research. So I had access to a lot of the science stuff, but then would get the lens of young Earth creationism to look at it and reinterpret. And so there was a lot of cognitive dissonance going on in my head growing up from these are what, such and such a book would say, but then it really must be this. And by the time that I went to college for geology, I went to Calvin College, and Dr. Davis A. Young was one of my geology professors, and tried very much to get me to turn my head away from young Earth creationism and think a little bit more logically, but failed, sadly. It would be quite a few more years before I had the both opportunity and need to start reevaluating. 2002, I came into a little bit of money. And so since there was an economic downturn in the private schools in the US. I had the opportunity to use that financial gift that I'd received and turn it into a project to try and work on a way to have a proper mechanism for flood geology. Dr. Walter Brown had his idea of hydroplate theory, which was becoming very popular in young Earth creationism circles. Taz Walker had a very Answers in Genesis flavored version of that theory at the time. And so I thought, well, let me take this chance and try and solve one of the big dilemmas in flood geology, and that's the stratification of fossils. Why do we find the fossils in the order that we find them in? And so I had a large enough collection. I have about 100,000 fossils that I've got from around the world, plants, animals, insects, and a variety of other things. And also had a number of friends, both at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City and a few colleges in New Jersey, where I could do some minor experiments with the fossils I had in my collection, do some testing, and so spent 5 years trying to work out a effective process for why a flood, a global flood, would create the stratification we see. And nothing ever worked. The math just never, ever added up. And I was getting more and more frustrated. And then in, I think it was 2009, a friend of mine had invited me to join this Facebook group called Celebrating Creation Through Natural Selection. And so I joined, was introduced to a variety of people who had similar stories to mine in creationism, but had taken a very different turn and had left young Earth creationism. And feeling somewhat arrogant and superior, as sadly a lot of creationists may tend to do, I made a challenge that I'll study one topic that somebody might bring up that they think would break my young Earth creationism. And a fellow Brit had mentioned stromatolites, and that was the study that I undertook. And I had a few stromatolites in my collection, one being a banded iron stromatolite that was at around 3 billion years old. And between the experiments that I did on that and compared it to the stromatolites that I had from more recent formations, I noticed the chemical formulas and isotopes were radically different with the very old versus the younger. And that was kind of the breaking point. I'd gotten frustrated with a failure on math to prove young Earth creationism for quite a few years, and now here was yet another math problem and some basic chemistry that was showing me that in my own collection, stuff that I knew and had collected and saw through the microscope and through the testing, that it was not fitting in with the theology that I had. Uniquely enough, at the same time, I was now a professor for a seminary in New Jersey, and one of my students had asked me a question on, well, this passage in Revelations where Jesus is the Lamb slain before the foundations of the world, what does that mean? And so in working that answer for them, I actually had turned on the TV to do a little bit of rest before I taught my class the next day. And the episode was The Marriage of River Song from Doctor Who. And as I'm watching this episode, they're trying to show and demonstrate how time is meaningless now that the Doctor has died and not died at the same time. And you've got woolly mammoths and Piccadilly Square right next to Roman centurions in their chariot. And as I'm looking at this episode, I'm like, that's not what timelessness would mean. timelessness would be, and I took a little philosophical physics journey that night in writing my response on Christ dying before there was a world to die for. And oddly enough, that was the last piece because that was also a theological element in my young earth creationism. A big argument is, how can you have sin and death before Adam sins? Since that's a very huge thing that Ken Ham and other young earth creationists will trumpet, they need time to move in beginning, middle, and end progression. But if we really do believe in a God who is outside of time, then God need not actually respond in a way that fits in that very nice, neat progression like we want it to. God can anticipate. God can do whatever God needs to do in order to have a creation that works. And that settled my theological, my scientific issues. And I realized that evening I no longer needed to try and wrap this cognitive dissonance in my life. I could release all those questions that I had, all of those nagging fossils that were not fitting in any way, shape, or form into a young earth creationist dogma. I could also release the theological issues and just realize God is bigger than our theology. And if God is bigger than our theology, who am I to stand in the way of the second testimony that God has placed before us, which is this wonderful creation in the world, and that which I can see and touch and feel teaches to me just as much of God's beauty as my theology that I translate his word into.
Thank you. Yeah. I do have a question, but I think I'll go to Marv next because I want Marv.
Am I allowed to interject and say how happy I am when Doctor Who is inspiring someone's theological explorations in that way? Sorry, I won't say anything more, but yeah.
Just so the viewers know, I got berated before the show started for not knowing much about Doctor Who and being a Brit. So I'm taking it on the chin. So, Peter, thank you, Peter. Marv, is your story more of a steeped in it like Peter's, or is it more like James's? Tell us your account, and then we can have some discussions about some of the finer points.
Sure, glad to. Thanks for having me. I think I'm somewhere in between. I think I can give hope to a lot of your viewers that are just laymen, right? That's really my story, is a layman from a small town, rural area, not great science curriculum, never went into the sciences. And in college, I was focused on architecture. And then I got married at a young age at 18. I'm focused on surviving in my job. But I was born and raised in the church. I mean, from day one, day zero. I mean, I was there 3 times a week with my mom and dad and my, 5 brothers and sisters. It was our life, right? And so I never lost that. That's the hope I have for people, is so many people now are deconstructing and losing their faith. To me, it's just so sad and unnecessary. But unfortunately, the church is not handling it well. And they're kind of ushering a lot of these young folks out the door. Now, I was midlife when I really hit the kind of the cognitive dissonance that has been described here by others. So mine started very simply, when I was about 13. I came home from school learning about the sun and the, science and that sort of thing. And I said to my mom, she's washing dishes. I go, hey, Mom, I learned about the sun and it's a star. And so I started talking about that. And she says, no, it's not a star, it's the sun. And so we have this debate, right? This is the beginning of my very long history of debates. I'm like, Mom, well, yeah, it's our sun. So we call it, it's our star, we call it the sun. No, the Bible says God made the sun and the moon, so it's not a star. And I realized from early on, my parents did not have the answers for me. right? And so I did the same at Sunday school and got kicked out of Sunday school. And, I asked too many questions. And, so innocently just asking about, wait a minute, I need this to make, I'm wired for everything to make sense. Things need to conceptually make sense. So went all the way through college and went to college in Abilene, Texas, Church of Christ. Okay. This is the buckle of the Bible Belt. I'm talking about fundamentalism, great place to start a marriage, and started working in architecture, but never got exposed to real science, never really had any education on evolution. So later on, I started realizing just some basic scientific things like starlight. And I was really focused on the heavens. I really liked Hugh Ross. I found this book. I don't know if you can see it. It's just a really simple little paperback. It's called A New Look at an Old Earth by Don Stoner, forward by Hugh Ross. So I was a Hugh Ross fan, right? And he does a great job of educating folks on some of the things about astrophysics and space. And then he relates them to the Bible. He's really good at that. He doesn't accept evolution still to this day. He has someone on staff, but Fuzzrana, but they don't accept evolution. So I read this book and I was like, well, maybe I need to think about this. And that was the beginning of a lifelong, what I call truth quest, which is really just more of a layman, not in the sciences, just getting exposed to the world on a daily basis and asking questions. And things did not make sense to me. And then I had a brother-in-law who was a science teacher in high school. I would argue with him. I would argue with him vehemently. And I was a very strong proponent of young Earth and anti-evolution. And then I was drawing out these big long timelines of Genesis. I was trying to reconcile everything, like some others have talked about. And I just kept hitting this brick wall. I'm like, this doesn't make sense. Things are not adding up. So I started reading because I had no other access through my church. And it was before Facebook. So I just started reading. And over the years, I just read all these different books. And I finally found, of course, this one's famous, The Language of Science and Faith, of course, is by Francis Collins and Carl Giberson. And so this one was really pivotal for me because what I was doing in my life is I'm going to church, I'm playing in the band, I'm a worship leader, I'm raising my 3 kids, I'm working on my marriage. And these things are over here causing dissonance in my brain. And I'm like, I can't really talk to people about it. I bring it up at church and they shut me down. No. This is how it is. This is what we believe. Basically, without saying it, if you don't believe like this, you can go somewhere else. So I started then I was about 40, and then Facebook came around and I became, this is a great platform, right? This is great. It's going to be like going down to the town square and having these philosophical discussions. It's going to be fantastic. It wasn't, right? I had argument after argument after argument with real friends and church mates, and it was ugly. And finally, my wife says, you got to stop. This is bad for everyone. And so what I did after a while is I started making all these Facebook friends, including all of you guys who we've never met, right? I looked up James Knight and I said, how do I know this guy, James Knight? So I call them random science and faith Facebook friends. I have probably almost 1,000 now. James Knight, I sent him a friend request in 2012. I don't know why. We were on some forum, same with all the rest of you guys. And then I kind of calmed down my Facebook rhetoric and my real life. And I just started reading books and doing online Facebook. And I started reading. But when I found this book at the beginning of my truth quest, I'm telling you what, I used to go to the bookstore and look at all the books on religion. Then I would look at all the books on science. And then I couldn't find what I needed. And then in between, it's like a small slice, right? Like 3 books on science and faith. And when I found this one, I went to the parking lot. I mean, I read the inside cover. I just started to weep. It was the first real hope I ever had. I mean, my wife was right there. She knew how sad I was and how alienated I was. And she was so happy that I found hope. But it did it caused a bit of a ruffle, in my marriage, because she was eventually like, hey, once I accepted evolution, that was the big one. And she's like, I didn't marry someone like this. So then we had to work through that, which we did. And now she's with me. She's joined me 100%. I still go to a church in America that's a non-denom fundamental. Pastor was my best friend. My daughter married his son. It's complicated. And they still don't accept any of this stuff. And somehow I'm having to figure it out. So I'll stop there and we can do question and answer on the rest.
Thank you. Yeah. Where to start? There's so much to unpack, isn't there? Peter, did you have any emotional challenges when you were starting to transfer over to the other side? Were there any internal cultural or familial pressures for you, or psychological pressures maybe?
There were definitely some challenges. At that time, I was a pastor at my church. It was a pseudo mega church out in New Jersey, and so we had quite a number of pastors on staff, and also being the professor for a lot of the theological topics for our seminary that the Assemblies of God was running in New Jersey, still is. So there were not so much a lot of internal things because my progress kind of ticked off the boxes, and it took about 5 years for me to finally go through that process and then realize, okay, I've moved from young Earth to old Earth and old Earth to theistic evolutionist. And so that was gradual enough for me that I didn't have internal issues, but I definitely had issues with a number of people at my church because a lot of them had seen me teaching young Earth creationist theology for, at that point, 20 years. Some of them even started attending the church because they had attended one of my lectures and realized, oh, Calvary Temple sounds like a fun place. And so that's where they went. And here I am now starting to go, well, I was wrong. And that caused quite a lot of kerfuffle in the church. One, pastors aren't supposed to be wrong. When we speak, it's almost with that same level of papal ex cathedra where, we're speaking from the chair. We've studied this, we know this, and then go, oh, well, I was wrong. And that causes a lot of tension. And then, a couple of people even were like, are you okay mentally? Do we need to do an intervention because you're sounding crazy? That hurt because a number of them were my friends and people I'd known as close as family. But at the same time, I also am a firm believer in going with what my convictions are. And by that point, I pretty much settled on, well, no, this really is it. I've spent enough time, spent enough money, spent enough research into this that I can't deny the findings that I have anymore. And it actually ended up leading to me being asked to leave the pastorship at the Assemblies of God, which is the main reason why I switched over to the United Church of Christ. It's a denomination that doesn't have doctrinal requirements. And so I am a lot more free to pursue my studies and my theological questions and processes there without having to worry about a review board calling me up to talk about my credentialing.
Yeah, thank you. James, one thing that I've experienced a lot of when I've talked to young Earth creationists is a sense of guilt and rigidity, psychological rigidity, in that we've discussed, and I've made one or two videos, and I've written lots of articles, and I've done the science to death almost with these guys, and it it became clear to me some time ago that for the vast majority of people I've encountered, possibly the same in America too, is actually some of the science, a lot of the science is perhaps a bit of a red herring for them. I think fundamentally, most of the experience I have of young Earth creationists is that they have a biblical objection, because to accept an old Earth and to accept evolution is to go against some of the literal interpretations of Scripture, whereby it then, to their mind, seems to be undermining some of the things that even Jesus and Paul are saying, say about Adam as a literal person. And I'm convinced that they won't budge, a lot of them, because of this insistence that whatever you say about the science, then it can't be true because my biblical precepts are black and white and literal and rigid. So as our expert in biblical language, no pressure. Could you give us a view from a biblical perspective, from your knowledge of what you think is going on there in terms of the biblical stuff, and where there might be some room for maneuverability with some of the hyperliteral stuff?
Yeah. So I think the key is actually to challenge the idea that they are actually being hyperliteral in any kind of consistent sense, right? On the one hand, are the days in Genesis 24-hour days rather than millions of years, something like that? Yes, right? But does a depiction of God following a sort of a working week have to be literal, even if the days within it are literal? Not necessarily, right? So there's the question of what's going on in this passage, if we're talking about Genesis 1. And you can show things like, the first 3 days, right? Days 1 through 3 and days 4 through 6, there's this parallelism, right? God creates these places, and then there's this filling of those places with, inhabitants. There's the dome, right? Which, the firmament, even the King James Version recognized it was firm. Amen. And, that word kind of had those connotations. I say that as somebody who doesn't speak Elizabethan English as my main language, but, so I'm told by linguists, right? And, if we look into the root of the word, right, it was, and so it was really interesting, so some of the influences on me, one is realizing that I was defending my doctrine about the Bible from stuff that the Bible said, right? And that's like inherently self-contradictory and self-defeating, right? I mean, that was a major influence in sort of shifting me out of, by that point, I was already getting out of things like young Earth creationism, but I stopped apologizing, right? Because sometimes I think some Christians are like, yeah, well, I'm still a Christian, I just don't take this so literally. So it's like, and there were some influences on me that helped me to stop feeling like I needed to apologize, as though these other people were being somehow more consistent, right? Another key influence was Keith Ward's book, What the Bible Really Teaches, which was about the fact that, those who claim to be biblical literalists are not in any consistent way. And so things like that, were influences. Another great anecdote from my own personal experience. So one of the campus Christian groups at Butler University, where I teach, brought a member of Ken Ham's organization, somebody named Terry Mortensen, to campus. And he was saying, when challenged, I think I said actually something about the dome, and he was like, well, no, the Hebrew doesn't mean dome and thing. And if you are somebody who is inclined to believe someone like that, you think they're defending your faith against attackers, then you'll side with them. Right? But we had this, it was a math professor who just was so fed up with this guy, and had no sense of young Earth creationism. His background, I think, was like Greek Orthodox. But he knew the scriptures well enough. He was like really diehard Greek Orthodox, and so he actually quoted, from the Beatitudes in Greek at him, just saying, like, blessed are the poor in spirit. That's what matters. And Terry Mortensen immediately said, I'm sorry, I can't understand Hebrew when I hear it spoken. So didn't even recognize what language it was. Never mind what was being said. And he had been speaking as though he was an authority on the meaning of the Hebrew word in Genesis, right?
Mhm.
And I was just really hopeful that showed that these people are bogus. They're charlatans, right? They're claiming to know stuff about linguistics when they don't do linguistics. They're claiming to know stuff about science when they spend all their time trying to disprove, scientific research, but they're very rarely out there actually, making progress, saying, okay, this paradigm gives us an alternative explanation, and look, now we understand things better. Here's all the, here are the results. Here are the petroleum deposits. Here's whatever. The actual payoff, literally or metaphorically from this thing, which, if it were true, would have consequences, right? And you could show it. And so, I agree with you 100% that, really it's the biblical claim that is what keeps people from seeing it. And so there's only so much you can achieve with science if that's the case. And so that's one reason why I try to spend a lot of time saying, okay, what's going on in Genesis 1? What's the reason for understanding it that way? What about the dome? Do you take that literally? What about this that gives the impression that, the earth, doesn't move, and here's your, and things like that? If you don't take it literally, why? Is it because of something else in the Bible, or is it because you actually have outside information, and so you're open to science informing Bible, and you take something non-literally, which people in the past might have? Since I'm mostly New Testament language and literature, I also often direct people to, the fact that Paul talks about human cognition happening in the heart, right? That's sort of where it's happening. And we can take that perfectly easily as a metaphor, but for precisely that reason, we can miss that for somebody in Paul's time, either it was just something that they accepted, that's where thinking happens, or they were part of a debate, between, the Platonists and Aristotle about, is it the brain or is it the heart? Because it was not clear at that point, right? And so we don't read the Bible. Even the people who are attempting or claiming to be literalists are not reading the Bible in a consistently literal fashion. And I think in order to get people to realize that, the focus absolutely has to be on the Bible, and not, and bringing more science and more scientific data into the picture won't get them out of that, because they'll just be like, okay, I'm just going to be all the more adamant defending my faith and what the Bible says, right? And so I think we do really need focus there.
Absolutely. And while I've got you on this, I think I ought to ask this simple question and the singular question here, because it comes up so often, and I think it's probably worth asking, which is, when Jesus refers to Adam, I'm sure we all have our ideas about what that means, but what would you say to somebody who just has this simple formula of, Jesus talks about Adam, Adam must therefore be a real individual person, therefore it must be literally true, and therefore the Bible must talk of a 6,000-year-old earth? What would you say to someone who's stuck on that and just can't get past that?
Yeah, so I'd say that if we look at how Jesus reads that passage, right, he's utilizing it in the context of a discussion about divorce, right, and says, that in Genesis it says the two shall become one flesh, right? And so he seems to be getting that, although this is a story about one person, the original Adam, right, human with a capital H, right? And if it was translated that way into English, I think already some readers would get a different impression, right? Because Adam is a name in English, whereas human, right, they might get that this is symbolic. But it's on the literal level, it's about one person becoming two. But Genesis itself, and then Jesus citing it, recognizes that it's actually a symbolic representation of this experience of two people becoming one, right? And feeling like you found your other half, right? And so even in that, Jesus seems to be aware of the fact that Genesis has an indication that it's a symbolic representation of something else. And we look at Paul as well, right? To bring Paul into it, because sometimes what Paul says about, through one man sin entered the world. It's like, okay, well, through two people sin entered the world, like Adam and Eve. Like Eve takes the fruit, eats it, and then gives it to her husband, who's standing there, right? So don't try and shift the blame away from the guy, right? He's there, right? This whole thing. Just had to throw that in there. But why is it through one man and then through one man? Paul is not taking this text literally, right? Which is about two individuals being involved in this original sin, if we want to call it that. He's making a contrast between Adam and Jesus, right? In the interest of a theological point. And so in all of these passages, we actually see this sort of not strictly literalistic engagement with the story in Genesis. And I think that close attention to detail actually can help someone actually break out of not so much out of a literalistic framework as though they were in one, but out of thinking they're in a literalistic framework, when in fact what they've got is always at most, partial, selective, literalism. The so-called literalists will often say, well, aren't you picking and choosing? And the appropriate answer, I think, is, you're picking and choosing and denying that you're picking and choosing, right? Being upfront about your picking and choosing is better, right? Whether we should pick and choose is, okay, we can have that debate, but pretending you're not picking and choosing while picking and choosing is picking and choosing plus dishonesty, which is not necessarily better than honest picking and choosing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've encountered many Christians who don't even accept that they're interpreting the Bible. They just think that they're just, as they just call it God's word, and I'm just taking it as God's word. Now, one of the really key things I wanted to talk about with you guys, it's something I've thought about lots, and I thought, well, people who used to either be friendly to or accept young Earth creationism at some level would probably be really well equipped to have a good insight into this question. So it's a complex one, but I really want to get to the heart of it, because I think it's at the heart of a lot of the debates that we're having with young Earth creationists. So I don't know if you know, and you may not know, but in one of my books, I separate the three types of people, not just young Earth creationism, but of any kind of ideology or belief system that has a strident influence. I use the analogy of hawks, pigeons, and sparrows. So in young Earth creationist context, the hawks would be the most influential and aggressive types of people. You're talking about the Grady McMurtrys, the Ken Hams, John Mackay, people like that. So they're the ones that are making a living out of this stuff. They're the ones on Revelation TV. They're the ones, having the Noah's Ark museums and all this sort of stuff. And then the pigeons are obviously less aggressive than the hawks, but they are still actively pushing this. They might be bloggers, they might be writers of non-mainstream books and that sort of thing. And the sparrows are the victims, if you like. They're the main victims of this, because they're the ones that accept this because that's what they've been taught by their pastors or their elders, and these guys in question at the hawk end of the pyramid. So the sparrows are by far the most numerous, of course, and they're the people that we'll find peppered throughout the churches who just believe this stuff because that's all they've ever been taught. Now, one of the questions on my mind for a lot of this period of discussion with them is to what extent they really do believe it, and to what extent they deep down know that it's probably not true, but because of all the cultural and social and family pressures, and because of the biblical black and white that we talked about, they just can't get to that place inside where they're brave enough or cogent enough to understand. And particularly given that the sparrows often are going to be people who don't really know much about the science or much about the arguments anyway, they're just going to assume that that's what they should believe. So if we could just start with because I think this is actually this is the crux of the matter, really. If we could start with the Hawks, the people that you guys know a lot better than I do, the Ken Hams and people like that, people who are making a bit of a racket out of this young Earth creationism, they're influencing a lot of people. They must know the impact it's having. They've got a lot to answer for. They also are bombarded with criticism from people who understand the science and the theology, but certainly the science a lot better than they do. And that can't just have no effect on them. They must inwardly be thinking, well, hang on a minute, I'm not getting any prizes from scientific peer reviews or Nobel Prizes or anything resembling proper credentials for the sort of nonsense I'm putting out there. Now, what do you guys think about that? I'd like to hear from all of you on this. To what extent do they really believe it and they're just living in this sort of reservoir of suppression? Or to what extent are they just kidding themselves and fooling themselves and just don't know how to really make sense of this stuff? And what do you think about that?
I think it's a good question. I think most people start off with good intentions, including Ken Ham, but he's got, a basic level of science, like a high school science teacher. And then he becomes famous. And the problem is it becomes follow the money and it becomes political, and they just can't go back on it. I mean, I think they know, and I have a big problem with that. I have a big problem with deceiving people. And so I think at a certain time, it's more honorable to do like Peter did, come out and say, you know what, I've learned some more. I think I was wrong, and let me help you understand why. Because, I don't see people doing that. And I disrespect that they take that position and they, build this gigantic arc and have thousands of people coming. And then to me, the victim are the kids. The adults I'm not so worried about, but the kids come and they learn this stuff in homeschool, and they go off and learn other things, and they equate their faith to young Earth creationism, and then they flip the switch. I've seen it over and over and over. Oh, okay, well, evolution's true. The Earth is old. Well, forget all this stuff my parents taught me. That crazy guy with the arc. And I mean, I think that's what's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just second what Marv said, that this they predict that if evolution is true, then the Bible can just be thrown in the trash, and they actually are actually encouraging people to throw out their faith when they discover that this false teaching of theirs is false. Yeah. And so I can't, I don't have access to anybody's heart or mind. I can't tell you which of them believe this thing and to what extent. All I can say is that there are psychological studies of the fact that when somebody's been waiting for 45 minutes for a bus, they're more likely to keep waiting, even though there's an ever decreasing likelihood that it's going to ever show up, because of the time they've committed to it. And so once one has maybe been roped in as a sparrow, has been deceived by this thing, but then actually moved up the echelons into the organization and is promoting it actively, then you're much more likely to continue doing so, and to just find ways, however implausible, to explain away counter evidence, right? Because a lot of people are happy, not just, they're not looking to see, can I follow the evidence where it seems to be pointing? It's like, as long as there's some possible counter explanation, some way to explain away this, counter claim or something like that, however unlikely or uncertain it is, as long as there's something, then they'll carry on with this thing that they've committed so much time and effort to, right? And so that's one reason why I'm actually thankful that I did not grow up steeped in this, did not have this as part and parcel of my faith. And so jettisoning it was something that could happen sort of independently from belief in God and Christian faith and other things like that.
Yeah. So Peter, you mentioned cognitive dissonance, and that's obviously a common phenomenon. So, do you think there was a point when you were in your deepest mire of young Earth creationism, was psychologically, internally, did you feel like you were convincing yourself in a way and fighting inner battles that you sort of suspected that you weren't giving it the full attention it deserved, the alternative, or
No, actually, I would say it was kind of the opposite. When um, you know, throughout that 20 years where I was actively teaching young Earth creationism, um, there was two parts. One was well, this is fact, and therefore anyone who disagrees with it is just wrong. And that's a very powerful lie that we tell ourselves. It's no one likes being wrong, and so we tend to, when somebody says something that we disagree with, clearly they must be wrong. And so it's just a part of human psychology to deny the validity of the opposing side. And you can see that in politics. You can see that in so much of the culture war that's going on today. Obviously, if you believe this, then you're just plain wrong. And I can tune you out because you either have an agenda that you're trying to convince me of, or you are deluded yourself. And so there's that tinfoil that we wrap around our heads to shield out from the opposing view. And it's a very sad part of human nature. And it does take a lot of, for lack of a better word, bravery to delve into the possibility that you're wrong, that you are actually the one who needed to do more research. Because we have also a lot of perception bias. We'll read the things that agree with us, and especially with the way that information is disseminated today through algorithms. I open up my Google account, and all of the news articles agree with me. And that's a very comforting thing for me. Clearly I'm right because Google is sending me these articles that agree with me. And so that confirmation bias is just spiraling worse and worse today. But even in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when a lot of us were starting our journeys into learning things, what did we have access to? Sometimes you could go into the library, like Marv was saying, and you see so many books on this subject and so many books, but there's only 3 that merged faith and science. And when you have people like Dawkins or Coyne or some of the others who are really advocating a very anti-theist dogma, that warning of evolution leads to that, frightens a lot of people. And so we worry about, if we delve too much into the opposite camp, what kind of damage can we do to ourselves? And then for myself, the Assemblies of God has very specific dogmatic things that you are supposed to believe. And if you don't agree with those, then you get called up and are held accountable before your elders, or in my case, my presbyter board, who said, well, you disagree with these fundamental truths, and because of that, we're going to financially restrict you and, rescind your credentialing.
Yeah, I think it's important as well, as you mentioned, that the other side of this, which is that, if you like, if we consider ourselves fairly mainstream Christians in this sense, at least, the young Earth creationists are at one extreme of the Christian fundamentalist spectrum, but actually what we've got is a cultural war with atheists at the other end, and to me they're almost like young Earth creationists with the signs reversed. They are they are the fundamentalist wing of the atheist group, who actually, if you listen to what people like Dawkins and Hitchens and people like that said, and they also think that evolution is incompatible with the Bible. So on the one hand, you've got two extreme sides of the debate which are influencing lots of people. And on the other hand, you've also got the fact that, well, I think the creationists are clinging to their young earth creationism as well, because to them, evolution means no God. And all the atheists are telling them that evolution means God is no longer needed. So there seems to be this sort of, coming together almost in a sort of cult-like mentality where we're fighting the new wave atheists as well to keep the last vestiges of the Christian belief.
Yeah, I've seen that. I stay away from the really rabid atheists. But I did force myself to learn real science, and I think that is a real sticking point with the people I'm talking to at church. They'll engage me philosophically and scientifically, but when we get to a certain point, I said, "Well, have you read this book? Have you read this book?" No, I don't. I don't believe in evolution. And they list off all these books, and they're all by Ken Ham or the other group that does. It's more the irreducible complexity and some of that's a higher level than Ken Ham, but still not accepting evolution. And I said, well, if
Intelligent
you
Design Group, yeah.
Design, yeah.
But if you never read it, you can never understand it. So I've read about 10 years, like about 70, 80 books, but I read both sides. I forced myself. I would read one about intelligent design, then I would read the alternative to that and go, okay, well, truth is somewhere here in the middle. I think you're right about we get so tuned in to our group and we just can't hear anything else. A couple other things I'll mention as tools. These have helped me a huge amount. This is the Lost World of Genesis 1. And unfortunately, I think John Walton. So I didn't find this till recently, and everybody else has read it. It's from 2009. And he is a very distinguished professor of Old Testament at Wheaton. They're talking about Bible Belt. This guy knows what he's talking about. He knows the Old Testament. He's been teaching it for like 40 years. He is trusted by fundamentalists. And he talks about what Genesis literally means, right? Ken Ham thinks he's teaching what it literally means. And it's not what Ken Ham is talking about. This is a huge tool. Another guy that's right on the cutting edge, I went and saw him recently, William Lane Craig. Do you see that? This is dark because it's got a fairly old looking primitive person on the cover, which turns some people off. But William Lane Craig is probably one of the most respected Christian philosophers of our modern time. And it's In Quest of the Historical Adam, Biblical and Scientific Exploration. I mean, I don't have time to read this thing, right? You guys might have read it, but I had to get the Cliff Notes to see what his point is. But this guy is on the leading edge and he accepts evolution. And now he's saying in this book, Adam was way back. A literal Adam is like 200,000 years, not 6,000. So I don't think that most pastors or most people in the rows know this information. And unfortunately, the pastor's not going to give it to them because they don't know it. And so you have to find your own way. But to me, if you're seeking truth, there's a biblical principle that God will not let you down. If you're seeking truth, you will find it and it will be God in the end, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's been my truth quest all along is I'm not looking to rebel. I'm not looking to go against the church. I'm not looking to doubt God or deconstruct my faith. I want things to make sense and I want ultimate truth, which is kind of, a lot of people poo-poo that. And when I used to tell people what I do for fun, because, I got my day job, I try to reconcile science and faith. They just laugh and walk away. They're like, oh, well, good luck with that. But you have to put some effort into it. You have to read and you have to tune into some of these, really educated folks in theology and science.
Yeah, and I think that's what, and for any viewers watching, I think that's absolutely right. I think if you are struggling with to reconcile the two, or if you have any doubts based on what you've heard, then pray about it, because if you take this to God, and if you genuinely, and this is true of anything, if you actually want to know the truth about anything, then God is maximally incentivized already for you to know the truth. And it just takes humility to lay it on the table and say, I don't know about this, or I'm struggling with this, or am I wrong, or have I got it right? Because if you are right, then actually you'll be compounded, and you'll be even stronger. Just take it to God, because I think we should probably wrap up soon. But what I think is interesting about now, and and you mentioned Marv, you mentioned Francis Collins earlier, who the founder of the Human Genome Project, and we now have a situation where it's impossible. If there was any doubt and any debate in the past, we now have a situation in 2024, and we have had for a long time now, where it's impossible to understand the scientific basis for biological evolution, particularly genetics, and not accept the evolutionary story. And we've discussed a bit about how the two are perfectly reconcilable side by side. There's a compelling predictive element to evolution, isn't there? Descent with modification, we'd expect to see more and more molecular convergence. The further back in time we studied historical DNA, which is exactly what we do find. If you travel back millions of years, you find ancestors of organisms X and Y. They're going to be historically similar. And we've got this absolutely mapped out to a T. There's no question that evolution has happened, that we share common ancestry with all the other species, and the ones that are most similar to us are clearly genetically more similar because of recency. So I guess what we're finding is, if you either have to not know this stuff, or if that is coming against you, then you have to, which we are finding, I think, a regrouping into an even more fundamentalist mindset. So it's been really, really good to talk to you guys, and thank you so much. I'll let you have the last word. So if you could each just give a closing, what would you say to someone who's watching this from your own perspective, to encourage them that there is a way to get out of the quagmire of young Earth creationism, and from the psychological fear, from the cultural, and what would you say to them if they're watching this and thinking maybe these guys are onto something here?
Well, I almost chimed in when you were talking about, you mentioned humility. I would ask them, humility is one of the core teachings of Jesus. And how much humility do they see in the people that they're listening to? But also, how much is it part and parcel of how they understand faith, right? Because, for me, when I was a young Earth creationist, faith was about, being right, and supposedly it's about God being right. And since you don't have direct access to God in the way that, although Pentecostals sometimes may claim that, but, the Bible gives us, it's all the more certain and concrete. And so if I'm convinced that this is what the Bible says, but other people with whom I disagree might actually be reading the same scriptures, right? And so you actually have to listen, right? And you have to be open to correction, because we as human beings are fallible, right? That's core, right? That we're capable of sin, right? All that is so central to the Christian faith. And that's what makes young Earth creationism and things like it not just, problematic, but actually diametrically opposed to some central teachings of Jesus and of Christianity, right? And so I think the thing is, if you are only reading things by Ken Ham, you don't have faith, you have fear, right? You are afraid to expose this house of cards, to actual critical analysis, right? And avoiding anyone taking a close look, including yourself, at your beliefs and your structure and your concepts, that's not faith. That's not trusting God, right? That's trusting in being right, and that's not what Christianity is supposed to be about.
Amen. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, James. Peter.
For me, the understanding of God is bigger than my theology was a very important step. I had spent several decades building a very tight box to try and fit God into, and realizing that that's what I was doing kind of also broke me. Letting God be God is an important thing. And sadly, our theology doesn't allow for that. We create dogmas that become more prisons than they are shelters. And so having the faith that God will continue to walk with you as you explore your questions and seek knowledge. Jesus said, if you seek it, you will find it. And that was more than just about the kingdom of God. That was about understanding all of this creation that God has given us. And so being encouraged to just go forward and let God guide and support and love on you. That would be my words of encouragement for those who are struggling.
Amen. Thank you. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would say you need hope. You need, if you're really wired, and this is important, you're wired for finding truth. There is a lot of resources out there. Like these three guys, I've never met them in person until today. I consider them brothers and friends. I've had serious counseling sessions with, when I hit the wall and I had trouble in my marriage, people like these guys are counseling me, I mean, that's real life. And, and also this stuff's important, but it's not the most important thing. Love is. And if you're losing a family member, a child or a spouse, you know what? You got it. I multiple times told my wife, you are more important than this. I'm on a truth quest, and I put it all away. I put it under the bed in the spare room. I said, that's it. And that's what she needed at the moment, right? And then she learned to trust me, and then she would learn more. And then she started coming alongside and joining me, and she would hear things and go, that doesn't sound right. And it's a long journey. I think a couple of times we've mentioned 10 years, 20 years. This doesn't happen overnight. Mine was really from 40 to 50 years old, intensely. Once my kids were grown up and out of the house, I can read, right? And so I did. But you know what? It's okay to not, it's okay, really. And I have family members and friends that are still younger creationists. I worship next to them. I played in bands. And it's okay. Like, love is the most important thing. And if you hold on to that, you will figure it out.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. That's really good. And yeah, I should say the four of us met on a Facebook group called Celebrating Creation by Natural Selection, which we've mentioned. And yeah, if anyone is watching and curious, I'd encourage you to join. It's a friendly group. It's well moderated. It's got so many people with so much experience of both sides, and so many people who are scientifically trained. You can lurk and just watch what people are saying. You can contribute. You can ask any question. It's a great place, and we've all been very blessed by it. And there's a lot of people that know a lot of stuff. You'll find an expert in most scientific disciplines there. So yeah, I'd encourage you to do that. And thank you. It's been so good to chat with you guys. And I've got, say, three more who've showed an interest. So we'll probably do another show with three of my other guests. And yeah, I'm James Knight, the Philosophical Muser. My blog link is down below. And thank you so much to James, Peter, and Marv for a great discussion. And I hope it's been helpful to you and to the viewers. Thank you very much, and see you next time.